Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I just want to let you know before we start the episode that we ended up having to make this a two-parter. We have a special guest, as you'll hear about, and his knowledge is vast, and the conversation was good. So we decided to make it into two parts. This first part is pretty much just about martial arts, and the second part, which will be coming later this week, is about the pandemic and the government's response and stuff like that. You'll see, but this guest is uniquely qualified to speak about both of those things. So, without further ado, here's the episode. Did you just give yourself the hiccups by smoking weed? Welcome to Phone Wallet Keys, David Ortiz.
A very exciting episode. I'm very excited about this episode.
I had a couple too many cups of coffee because I was so excited, and now I'm kind of a little scared. Well, before we get into why this episode is going to be so fun, I just want to say if you are not yet a patron of Phone Wallet Keys David Ortiz, you have been missing out on 2/3 of our episodes. So you've missed an episode, a really fun episode last week where we did a deep dive on the 2008 Celtics championship run, but we talked about a lot of other fun stuff too. We also, the other sports podcast that you missed was a reliving of the Patriots comeback against the Falcons in Super Bowl 51. And then two non-sports podcasts that you missed were the podcast where we found out about Bernie Sanders. It was about Bernie Sanders quitting the race, and the other one was just kind of about our quarantine lives and Joe Biden and stuff. So those episodes are still available if you become a patron. Patreon.com/phone wallet keys David Ortiz. And in addition to those 4 episodes, we have new content that's going to roll out. And any day now, we're going to do a 2004 Red Sox podcast, and that's going to be so fun. And we will continue to keep doing other non-sports podcasts too. So please, if you can, support us and the podcast. And if you are out of work or out of money, but you still want to listen, send us an email or something, and we can figure something out. So,
Yeah, if you have a moral, if you like, there's also been a few of you who have let me know in no uncertain terms that though you're curious about the content, you have a moral problem with supporting the Geller brothers in any way, which I totally understand. And you can also listen to for free because I think that's a really good reason to not give us any money.
I'm sorry. It's not true. What he's saying is not true. Max is the one who has a moral problem with people supporting us. It has to do with his own self-worth, as far as I can understand, or his conception of, because he refuses to reach out to his network of people and let them know about our Patreon program and ask for donations. So the person he's projecting right now, it's not true that there are people out there that are telling him that they have a moral problem with this. It's him. He's talking about himself right now, and I don't know. I mean, what else is there to say, Max? Are you there? Did I lose you? Fuck. I lost you after I was explaining to people that you were projecting. Did you have anything to say in your own defense?
Yes, I did, and I'm sure what you had to say was fucking bullshit. And it's only because people don't actually care enough to explain how your moral turpitude prevents them from giving you money. But it does, and it's fine. And I admire that. I admire my former friends who listen to the podcast but refuse to give us money on moral grounds. That's fine.
What's moral turpitude mean?
Turpitude.
What does that mean?
It's like having severely degraded morals.
Who has said that they have a moral qualm?
Criminally
Give me
degraded.
a name.
I'm not giving you a name. I'm not doxing our fucking
You're literally
friends.
it's just yourself that you're talking about. You-
That's
I just
not
want
true,
to
Sam.
let you know that you are loved.
I don't care
You are
that much.
lovable and you are loved. I love you and other people out there love you too, and you deserve to be loved.
Sam, shut up. We have to get ready for Roger. Do you guys know what's
Okay,
coming?
so who's Roger?
Roger is my former martial arts instructor in New Orleans. This is one of the most highly functional people I've ever met in my entire life.
Coming from you, it just means nothing at all.
He is of particular interest to this podcast, not only because he holds black belts in several martial arts forms, but he also spent more than a decade
working for a government agency that we've been asked not to name.
So has a unique perspective on what's happening right now with coronavirus, I'm sure. You met him once.
Yes.
What was your
I was
impression?
extremely impressed by my one meeting with him. I mean, actually, so I came and visited Max when he lived in New Orleans. I'm sorry. I came and visited you, brother, when you lived in New Orleans, and upon your insistence, you were taking some Aikido classes there, and you were like, this Aikido is totally garbage, and everyone fucking sucks, except this one guy who's really good, and he's just kind of, this is like, Aikido is like the third or fourth martial art that he's doing. And you loved him. So I came and took the class, and the class was actually even worse than you explained. And I was like, I mean, we should get into it with Roger, I guess. Maybe he won't want to talk shit about the class in the same way that we will, but then we ended up doing some informal training. You and I, and just got, somehow Roger was like, I kind of thought that he was a little bit imaginary, but he ended up being real, and he was extremely impressive. His martial arts knowledge was impressive, but also he was just funny.
He is the most functional man. He'll teach you how to do knife stabbing and gun disarmament, and also, okay, this is a true story. One time I was talking to Roger, and he's like, "Yo, Max, I remember the first time I heard about structural patriarchy, and I was pissed. I was like, fuck, And then I was like, what the fuck am I going to do about this? And then I realized I'm going to teach women how to fight for free. You know what I mean? I have hung out with some pretty awesome male feminists before, but not a single one of them could articulate so succinctly a way that they personally are going to help dismantle patriarchy.
That's a great introduction. I think without further ado, let's get him on the line.
Cross me up! Don't snap, don't breathe, just to leave me on this skin. And baby, begin!
I'm recording.
Okay. In that case, welcome to Phone Wallet Keys David Ortiz, Roger.
I'm really sorry for the delay.
We've been having a little bit of technical difficulties just trying to set this whole thing up.
And to be clear, everybody, Sam has been
technological-
totally cool about it. He hasn't had any fucking emotional meltdowns at once, no matter how arduous this process has been, like a fucking cliff against the high tide. He has been resilient and unmoved, despite the battering he's been taking.
What a poetic
Stolid.
and beautiful person you are, Max. The difficulties that we've been having, unclear if they're technological or if they have to do with the idiosyncratic brain. If I'm being generous, I'm going to call it an idiosyncratic brain of my brother, who's capable of such beautiful poetics, and yet at the same time, it just functions on a basic level. It functions so slowly, and never mind. We need to start the podcast. Let's get into it. Roger is a guest we're having on the podcast. We're so lucky to have him on here. That's because Roger is an expert in several different kinds of martial arts, and he used to work for a federal agency that we are not allowed to name, but it was a federal agency that would deal in pandemic response, society's pandemic response. Is that true, Roger?
That is accurate, yes. And thanks for having me.
So can we just table that and go right into martial arts? Roger, what fighting systems do you incorporate into your personal repertoire?
So, kind of a longitudinal history of what I've been up to, basically my entire adult life. And so I started with some traditional striking arts. This is 20 plus years ago. And because of, going to graduate school in various places and living in different major cities in the US, kind of dipping into different styles for, anywhere between 2 and 10 years at a time. So these days, I live in a quite rural area in Alabama on the beach. And so I drive, 20 miles or so to train at a 10th Planet style jiu-jitsu school. So it's a no-gi system, Eddie Bravo, flat earth, look it up. But the technical repertoire is quite good. And that's been very satisfying, until all these goings-ons began a while ago. Obviously, no social distancing protocol is going to work for that type
For
of
jujitsu.
training. Yeah, it's not going to work out. So while I was in Atlanta, I did Aikido with a USAF school and also trained Filipino martial arts with a gentleman who became like probably one of the most major influences on the way that I look at martial arts, both as a system of thinking and a vocabulary of physicality. He was a black belt in a kind of a more basic style, and then took on Filipino martial arts at the same time doing Aikido. So I try to do my best to at least have an answer at each range of combat. So at the long range, the medium striking range, the stand-up grappling range, and the ground game range. You don't have to be an expert at each range, but you have to have some answers at each of those ranges.
Okay.
And so it's less about style, more about range. Yeah, go.
I just want to say that you've spoken very eloquently, and it's really fascinating stuff. But I'm worried that we have now gone too long without anyone insulting each other, and so I just want to insert
go.
now. We gonna have to break this up a little bit. Do you has all of your martial arts training enabled you to just have an eye test where you can look at both me and my brother on this Zoom conference right now and determine which one of us would win in hand-to-hand combat? Let's say close range.
Well, let's go through each ranges. I think at the stand-up grappling range, so very close range, but still on your feet. I think Sam's going to be the winner. I mean, that's just a fact. However, I think if we go a little deeper to the next range, if we get to the ground game, I think Max might have the edge because
why is that?
The first time I brought him to jiu-jitsu, he's throwing elbows to people's faces. And that was
I hate
that was
losing.
an unknown. You know what I mean? And you don't see that kind of behavior. So I think that gives him a clear edge at that range.
You're saying that his advantage is his willingness to fight dirty in like ways that are actually so sadistic, creatively sadistic, that no one has ever encountered them before, and that's actually going to give him a slight advantage.
I think Max's complete disregard for social norms is really the strategic advantage in this discussion that we're having. You understand what I'm saying?
You're the best guest we've ever had. I mean, we're like 5 minutes in.
I'm trying.
Listen, this is going very, very poorly, and I want to change the conversation up a bit. So, Roger, one of the things that you said to me that has really stuck with me is that, and I think this goes back to what you were saying about having an answer for everything, is Given the onset of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the rise in popularity of MMA, any douchebag you encounter on the street is liable to have like 6 months of jiu-jitsu training. And so you better have at least an answer for like a schmuck's 6 months worth of BJJ training. Because if someone gets you in a Kimura lock and you don't know what to do about that because they can fuck you up if you don't know how to get out of that. So like
That's really interesting.
Unlike, say, Filipino having an answer for someone who's really good at kickboxing or Filipino martial arts, BJJ is one of these things that is a good idea to like because of how many douchebags know it, right?
Yeah, I would say given the popularity of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, like this is actually what's going to make this like that's the draw of this podcast is that there are people out there who listen to this podcast and have 6 months of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training as you're describing, Max. So I would love, Roger, if you know about the brief history of
how did this happen?
Yeah, like the rise of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because isn't it a thing with like UFC that original UFC it was this idea that it would have people from wildly different backgrounds fighting each other. So you would have a sumo wrestler fighting a kickboxer fighting a aikidoist and then that this was part of the Gracies, the family that is kind of responsible for modern Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu rather, had a hand in this and they like it turned out that this style of martial art was kind of like tailor-made in a laboratory to succeed in this environment, that you could take down a sumo wrestler and you could take down a boxer, you could take down these different people, a kung fu artist who had never experienced grappling, and that this is in part what is responsible for the rise of popularity in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Is that true?
I think it's a twofold approach to the question. First, in the early days of UFC, MMA, they were pitting people of radically different styles, and each one of those styles was only successful at a particular range. And so the Gracie strategy was to overcome and enter as quickly as possible to engage in stand-up grappling or ground grappling, and fundamentally the environment, the actual physicality of the cage privileges going to the ground, especially if it's just man to man and you're not trying to escape, because in the cage, evasion is not an effective winning strategy. In real life, you can run away, right? But you can hit and go. But in the cage, you have to see the fight to completion, which again privileges going to the ground in that environment. The second part of the answer to the question is, unlike other martial arts, when you join a jiu-jitsu gym, you are getting the experience of randori or rolling on day one. So you're getting your ass whipped, but the fulfillment, the emotional content of, grappling on the ground with another person, even though you suck, is very fulfilling for a lot of people. And it kind of gives jiu-jitsu a emotional marketing edge over other martial arts, because you walk in day one, you're rolling around the ground, getting sweaty, you're learning, you're also getting fucked up, and that's all fine, and that's very appealing. So the teaching methodology of jiu-jitsu, I think, probably has more reach in terms of popularity than some kind of diagnostic concerning the early days of UFC, if that makes sense.
That makes sense, yeah.
So Roger, if you're hiring, if you own a bar in New Orleans and it's like Roadhouse vibes, and are you hiring a bouncer who doesn't know jiu-jitsu in 2020?
I think the answer is yes, but that's probably the not optimal choice, especially in a security environment. A bar is basically an emergency. And the emergency is people's emotions are all over the map because they're drinking. So there's always that potentiality of an outbreak happening in the moment, of something bad happening, because that's all a fight is, a tiny emergency. Because if you find yourself in a fight, something went wrong, right? By definition, hopefully. Definitely. Unless you're a sociopath. So and these days,
Don't
going
listen
back
to
to
that,
Sam's.
Max. Max, don't listen to that. That's a topic for a different discussion. Roger, go ahead.
So in these days, I think most people that work, especially in high volume bars, are going to have some kind of technical training at the minimal level. And 6 months here, 6 months there. Maybe they train with a friend. It's rare in the cities. I think, having not lived in a city for some time, to have just some, hey, I'm big, I'm a bouncer. Most of these guys have some kind of technical knowledge.
Do you remember being a bouncer in New Orleans?
I never worked in the bars in New Orleans as much as bars back in
Baton Rouge?
Baton Rouge and other places in the surrounding area. And, the issue there was, it's a college town. So
Sure.
people were drinking like it's the end of the world, right? And that, again, creates emergencies and, kind of, even if you're at a giant party, and I don't know if this happens anymore, but back in the day, we would organize block parties on the fly because you could get a permit. There might be 800 people there, 1,000 people there, and there's 10 houses on the road, and all these people are there, and so that is its own kind of like tactical nightmare where who knows what's going to happen, and people are there till 4 a.m. and you've got a lot of fun happening, and wherever there's fun, there's going to be problems, and that is something to think about. Go ahead.
I'm struck by two things. The first is for just like it's like amazing for me to hear about how the vast majority of situations where a fight would break out, it requires like people being really drunk, and it's just like a interesting reminder for me to hear that, having grown up as Max's brother, in which a fight is liable to break out at any time of day, in any circumstances whatsoever. Alcohol is absolutely not a determining factor whatsoever. And so, and I guess I've just kind of grown accustomed to that over the years. So it is always like, I'm like, oh yeah, for most people, they would only ever experience something like this, like in an environment with like there's a ton of people around and they're all wasted, and then that's like the special circumstances in which this is a possible thing that you might need to prepare yourself for. That's the first thing I'm struck by. The other is that martial arts in that specific context of the bar, and maybe you have experience with this, maybe you don't, Roger, but because I've heard this story of like a Brazilian jiu-jitsu, I don't know if he's a black belt or someone who's a really, really kind of well-known and well-respected jiu-jitsu practitioner who actually did end up getting into a situation in a bar, and how I've always heard this, that jiu-jitsu is the worst martial art to know in a bar, because when you go down in a bar, and let's say you're a grappling genius, you know exactly how to put someone into a lock, that actually doesn't help you from the biggest threat in the bar fight, which is not the person that you're fighting. It's the person running up behind you and kicking you in the head while you have them in an arm lock or something in the bar.
Jiu-jitsu has so many strengths, and as just a thing that I do with my time, a lot of my time, it's fantastic, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. I think in a bar fight, there are plenty of legitimate jiu-jitsu techniques that one could grab from your toolbox. But I do agree that in an environment where there are multiple attackers, you want to stay on your feet. And that is, just received wisdom. You don't want to be rolling around on the ground. Now, there are lots of stand-up techniques in jiu-jitsu. It's just that they're not really as privileged as they used to be when jiu-jitsu had more of a kind of direct relationship to its origins in judo. And
Right.
so if you can, wrap your mind around understanding judo and jiu-jitsu, now you're really cooking with grease, because you've got answers at the close range, the stand-up range. And now if it does go to the ground, fuck that dude up and then get back on your feet as fast as possible, right? So
Right.
don't continue down there, so it's, the techniques are legitimate, but the strategy has to change. So there's nothing wrong with the techniques, but you're thinking about it has to be altered according to the environment.
Did you have any experience when you were working in bars where you would have to apply any of your martial arts knowledge?
Just escorting people out, getting rid of them, getting them out of the door in a way that lets them know that they are in danger if they continue in this particular behavior, but without causing injury. And I think that's the good thing about Aikido and Judo and Jiu-Jitsu, these grappling arts that I always refer to as kind of cousin arts because they all come from the same place. They allow solutions that perhaps rely on pain compliance, but you don't necessarily have to maim or injure this person. And you can get them out of there without having to hit them in the face, right? Which is the wrong thing to do, both probably ethically and legally, not the right course of action in that environment. Just start cold cocking people if they haven't. It's like Philip McNamara in Errol Morris's Fog of War. He talks about proportional response.
Sure.
So from a legal framework, your response to the situation has to be proportional and slightly less than, right? So you can't keep escalating.
Robert McNamara
right?
is probably not the best example of proportional force.
Yeah, I mean, I think that movie was definitely a recounting of, his regrets in philosophical form, basically. But yeah, the idea of proportional response is pretty sound. If you're looking to protect yourself physically and to protect yourself from any kind of legal consequences in that environment.
So you've managed to be a consummate total badass your entire life and never have to answer for it in a court of law. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. Doing the right thing in terms of, again, proportionality,
right?
Getting out of situations, evasion, which is the kind of the lost canon of martial arts. We don't talk about evasion as much. I think there is some of that in Aikido. There's definitely some of that in Filipino martial arts. Max, we used to talk about takeoffs and moving at an angle away from the opponent by going past them, but striking them first, and that evasionary tactics, not just like talking your way out of a situation, but like literally leaving the situation and doing something on your way out besides just running, right? Because, martial arts is very much...
No, go ahead. I was unclear exactly. I was having a hard time picturing it, but what you're talking about is running away, but as you're running away, like throwing an elbow to the ribs or something like that, and then just like never looking
That's
back.
pretty much the gist. Yeah. So you're developing momentum by executing a foot switch to go away from him, but you're hitting him on the way out. And the reason that we don't talk about this, in my opinion, is because, this imaginary space in our mind that we call a street fight is very much peppered with the kind of social ideas of being a man. And so, like, in the form of the following, like, I'm going to finish this fight, or, I'm going to start what I finish, or even worse, I hit you, you hit the ground. So, like, these ideas of I have to finish this fight or I'm somehow less than are products of the masculine ego. They're preposterous from a strategic or tactical point of view. They serve no real purpose. And so if you can wrap your mind around that, running away and going back to your wife and going home is a completely legitimate option. So evasion is something to discuss. And I wish it were taught more, because it is completely legitimate if you can wrap your mind around the fact of, like, does this fight need to be quote unquote finished, or do I need to have a different option?
Like a hit and run option.
Yeah, we call it hit and get down here in Alabama. So you hit and then you keep moving. And, it's Filipino martial arts, man. It was, jungle warfare. So you don't necessarily have to, stick to this one guy when you got another problem heading your way 3 seconds in the future. See what I mean?
I mean, you brought up the Vietnam War like earlier, interestingly, and like that is also the strategy of guerrilla fighters too, in all kind of contexts. Is you strike and then you disperse and you hide, and even like in the American Revolution, where those tactics were employed by the revolutionary Bostonians who Max and I descended from. They were accused by the British of not fighting fair, and that is probably like that's maybe the origins of the same kind of masculine, hyper masculine idea of like you're supposed to just stand there. If you look at, I actually saw a video. I'll try and find it of the first recorded fist fight that they ever have, and it's from like 1905 or 190, and it's from the early 1900s outside of a mine in England, and it's these two like miners that are just getting off the clock, and they start like pushing each other, and they turn, and they literally are doing that like cartoonish thing, like the Notre Dame like fighting Irish thing, where the guys like, and they just stand there like exchanging blows, but yeah, and so then when you face a guerrilla army, you're not like they have no interest in standing there and exchanging blow for blow because they're obviously a lot like the numbers are so much smaller, the circumstances are different. They use that to their advantage.
So, in the history of warfare, broadly speaking, you're referring to asymmetrical warfare, which is, guerrilla warfare or distributed warfare. And, how does a force of inferior numbers generate a force multiplier to overcome an enemy of superior numbers? And that's through ideas. It's not, you're not going to outbomb, the U.S., but what you can do is create a situation like 9/11, which forces the United States into a long, intractable ground war. And the reason that we went to the Middle East after 9/11 is very, very simple. And it's one of the worst blunders in U.S. military history because we mistook strategy for tactics. The idea that like they blow up buildings and that's a hit. That was not a tactical attack. 9/11 was executed to bring the United States to the Middle East to get them bogged down.
Yeah, 9/11 was executed by the Bush administration in order to create the conditions by which they could justify getting bogged down in a Middle Eastern war, which would then satisfy both the oil industry and the military-industrial complex.
Well, simmer down there, Alex Jones. I think what I'm saying is that Al-Qaeda executed 9/11 as a strategic move in a broader game, knowing that the United States would retaliate in the only way that they know how, which is through war.
Sam,
and we're seeing
this
that
has
again
been a complete embarrassment of a podcast on your end the entire time. You need to just let the grown-ups do the talking and keep your conspiracy theories to yourself. Regardless of what you think happened in 9/11, the Geller brother analysis that the American project needs to be abandoned remains the same. So know your role and shut your mouth. Roger, as you were saying, if I can just bring it back to the one of my another thing that I really have hung on to that you said, and I think this ties back into what you were saying about masculinity is like the difference between an alpha male and a beta male who in martial arts training and how to become an actual serious badass. You've had to get your ass kicked so many times to get to that point. Like no one just become like, it doesn't matter how big and strong you are, to actually become a badass who can kick ass, you have to get your ass kicked. That's how you learn.
Sure.
Right? So as someone who is a serious badass, can you tell right away when you're like sizing someone up if they're someone you have to worry about or not?
I think it's a multivariant analysis. So, in our discussions back in New Orleans concerning alpha males and beta males, my point was that in popular parlance, we talk about alpha male behavior, and we all know what that is. I'm not going to rehash that. But that is the psychological illusion. That is that behavior is actually the behavior of beta males. That kind of strutting around, peacocking, all that kind of mess. That's beta male behavior, because a true alpha male doesn't need to exhibit any particular kind of behavior. because you are comfortable being here with these potential threats, because ultimately you've seen all these threats before. You know, getting your ass whipped over and over again for decades, you know, teaches you that I've seen these problems before. And it's not magic. It doesn't make you like somehow, you know, tough guy or whatever. What it gives you is the ability to quickly analyze the room, the whole room at one time. So that's a
Max,
conceptual project, not a, you know, physical one.
Max, it was extremely revealing of you as a beta male, your last comments in this podcast. And in fact, you steered the conversation away from where I wanted to go, which was I was going to ask Roger's advice about if we were going to wage an insurgent battle against the US government from within, from American citizens, if he had any thoughts about that. But what?
Can we wait? Can we wait? Let's not do that right now.
Why?
Because Roger has a whole unit on how to engage shield wielding Nazis. So I think this is just a logical extension to insurgency. Like Roger doesn't want to teach us like how like we don't need to be talking about like what kind of guns we should be loading up on. You know what I mean, brother? Let's just slow it down and talk. Like we have to talk about how to like what an assault run is and how to go on it, what a compound strike is. Like there's just basic tactics that I want to talk to Roger about before we get to coronavirus. All right.
Coronavirus? I was talking about fucking how to engage the political structure once voting is no longer an option. But I mean, Roger himself was making the transition to the coronavirus. It seemed like he was suggesting that something about our current response to it is akin to like the fight in Iraq, like our military misadventures in the Middle East, which is really interesting, and I want to hear more about. But Max, I'm sorry, you want to get into like the nitty gritty about different tactical strikes? I think could maybe do that too. Is that what you were talking about, Max?
Yes, brother. That's what I want to get into. I feel like we don't all often get a guy like Roger on the phone who actually knows what he's talking about. So, whereas ordinarily I would ask you and get the wrong answer, it'd be nice to ask Roger and get the correct answer.
Okay, so what do you want to ask?
So, Roger, if I were trying to prepare my body for combat, what kind of yoga classes do you think I should take?
That's a great question, Max, and I'm glad you asked it. A yoga class where the putative and largely fabricated spiritual dimension is largely absent from that class. I think that's a good first move.
How would I go about
Secondly,
even finding a class like that? It seems like every yoga class I've ever done, there's been like, even I'm like, oh, this class is going really well, and then they always manage to say some fucking ludicrous shit that just like,
well, you got to get middle class white people in the room, and the best way to do that is to overlay a completely fabricated spiritual tradition over a set of physical practices that do not have any roots whatsoever in some kind of extant Hindu religion, but in fact were part and parcel to the longest tradition of grappling in the world, which is Indian grappling. And if you look at any video on YouTube about Kalari Payatu or traditional Indian folk wrestling, you will see those yoga moves in there. They were drills that were slowed down and now they become yoga. They were sometimes actual techniques that were slowed down and now there's no opponent there. You're just on a mat. But this idea that, you know, there's this long tradition of brown people in India doing these moves and then meditating is false. That there is no historical evidence to support that. Now, that narrative is very convenient as a marketing tool because it adds a extra dimension of well-being and meaning over what is essentially a physical practice. So I think, you know, put some headphones in your ears and go to a yoga class. At a, I think Ashtanga is a good choice if you're just trying to get fit. There's some influence in that in my own practice. I think part of my irritation led me to take a teacher training with a very ornery Italian guy from New Jersey when I was in Atlanta, and he fulfilled all the stereotypes that you're thinking of right now. But he was also a great yoga teacher and no BS yoga teacher. And so I took the training, not so much to like, ooh, I'm going to be a yoga teacher, but I want to be able to practice at home safely, effectively, and teach myself to get better without having to go to a yoga studio. Because I want to do yoga. I just don't want to do yoga with you. You see what I'm saying? So that's probably your best choice. Go to a teacher training, and then you can teach yourself.
Is Ashtanga the one that won't let women do it while they're menstruating?
I think you're probably thinking of no, that is not the one. Yeah, there's all these kind of like attendant folk fabricated medical ideas that come along with yoga that you should definitely ignore. All of that. There is no evidence that any of that is real or even a tradition of anything that was called by the same name as yoga, a long time ago in another country.
It sounds a lot like what when Zen came to the West too, and it's like stripped of its entire context and reappropriated for capitalism. Basically, it's just like
so
now you can be a more productive worker if you do like a couple like 5 minutes of meditation on calm.com, and then you do these like poses, and then you can become one, and all of a sudden namaste, like go back to work for 10 hours a day.
Yeah, I mean, the samurai era was extremely what we would call now fascistic, and Zen Buddhism was a preparatory method to get people ready to accept the fact that they're about to go die. And it's hard to motivate people to go do that without some kind of attendant, philosophical or spiritual religious system. People are just not going to volunteer for that. And so when it comes to the West via the work of, Alan Watts or what have you, it gets a little whitewashed. And then the kind of like mutation that is speaks directly to what you're talking about, be a better worker bee. I am completely anti-mindfulness. I think that is just absolute corporate propaganda to get you to accept the fact that like, hey, your life is shitty and you have no political power and your children really don't have a future in the climate wars to come. But, when you eat that bagel before you go to work in the morning, like really concentrate on every chew. And so it kind of encapsulates you in this fake, happiness, which in and of itself is overrated as well. So I am definitely fuck mindfulness and all that horseshit. Like, no, what you need to be doing is getting your ass out of bed and working out and going to fucking jujitsu and being kind to people and cooking people food and stop being a dick. That's what you need to do. Sorry, go ahead.
Fuck microdosing for productivity. Macrodose. Tune in, turn on, drop out.
Yeah, man. I mean, everyone's microdosing, but
Sam,
no, man,
stop
you're just
belittling
getting
this
high because life is fucked up.
Yeah,
and
you're right, Roger. Roger, do you think that this sort of fraudulence that we see in yoga has creeped into other martial art forms? And is it such that, like, is there anything that you can actually pursue in the States long term that doesn't become just like a capitalist endeavor?
Yeah, I think the nice thing about martial arts is that typically, unless you're doing some kind of high-end weapon art, you don't need a lot of stuff. You can, especially no-gi jiu-jitsu, you just need some shorts and a t-shirt at the minimum. And so it doesn't require a lot of liquidity to go engage in these activities. And I think your analysis is correct, but your causal chain should be reversed. It is yoga that has learned the trickery of selling shitty physical practice from the martial art community, particularly of the 80s and 90s, kind of pre-MMA, where you could get away with selling people the idea that you can teach them how to knock people out with chi or, all that shit. which should be avoided, obviously. So America is littered with fantastic martial art instructors. I think there's been an explosion in both, Filipino martial arts and jiu-jitsu and other more eclectic styles that don't kind of run in the lane of like Japanese martial arts or Korean martial arts or what have you. Because people, want to do something that they can do long term. They want something that might be, effective in a altercation situation. And so there's plenty of that out there. But if you don't know anything about martial arts, having a rubric to make a judgment about what you're looking at is difficult. So I think one of the first questions to ask is, I'm at this new space, are all the students injured? That's a great question to ask, because that's something to think about. Is the instructor an asshole? Because you're going to be spending many hours a week with this person. That's a legitimate question to ask. I looked up this martial art on YouTube, and I like the way it looks, and it seems to make sense, even though I don't know any martial arts. Okay, that's less of a good metric, but it's still something to do. And, availability is an issue. So martial arts is always going to be more popular in big cities. So when I got out to the country, I was very lucky because there is a, high level, legitimate jiu-jitsu school, only 20 miles away. And that was a huge surprise. I mean, what a gem, just an amazing instructor, and the students, who are all quite younger than I am, are just young killers. I mean, they are tough as nails. I've never seen human beings absorb this kind of abuse before, and it really
great.
Just changed my mind. Like, wow, that's something that I'd like to check out. And I've been there since I got here now, and so yeah, it's out there, but you need to have some kind of rubric to judge and say to yourself, like, is what I'm looking at bullshit?
Can I tell
or does
you?
it have some kind of value?
Can I tell the story real quick of when Sam came to do an Aikido class? He came to New Orleans and severely injured the chief instructor at NOLA Aikido.
No, that's not true. I didn't injure anyone, did I?
You severely injured his knee. He stopped being able to walk during the class and ended it early.
I all I remember was leaving that experience and telling you that I think that you should find a good yoga class. I mean, I'm very interested. Like the last thing that you were talking about, Roger, just for selfish personal reasons. Like I want to actually ask about Aikido, because this is, for Max and I both have a lot of experience doing Aikido, and it's not because we had any sort of rubric whatsoever. It's just we inherited it. Our mother did it, and our mother had an incredible teacher who had a profound impact on her life. And when we were young, she sent us to go train with him. And so that's like kind of like Aikido found us more than vice versa. But you, who has this widespread knowledge of a lot of different martial arts, and you have done a lot of Aikido, I'm just curious how, like, what your thoughts are about this martial art that I spend so much time doing, and Max has done a lot. I mean, Max has branched out a lot more than I have, but
I have a very firm answer. So I think it's a categorical mistake to divide the world into the tripartite divisions that are now largely accepted in the martial arts community, which is traditional martial arts, TMA, mixed martial arts, sport fighting, whatever you want to call it, MMA, and, tactical martial arts, whatever that means to you, Krav Maga, etc. And
Capoeira.
That division, yeah. So those divisions, I think, are largely meant to make practitioners of each one of those divisions feel good about their art in comparison to the other two. I think a much better analogy and, way to think about martial arts is the toolbox approach. So when you go to your toolbox at home, 9 times out of 10, you're getting the same 5 tools: hammer, screwdriver, tape, whatever. But at the back of the toolbox, and you only pull it out once a year, is your collection of tiny screwdrivers that you need to repair your sunglasses because the little screw on the side came out and you got to put it back into place. Now, Are those screwdrivers less valuable than the hammer and the screwdriver? No, but they just have a smaller range of utility. So when you go to your toolbox, your big tools are basic striking, basic stand-up grappling and throws, basic ground fighting, particularly escapes, so you can get back on your feet and continue hitting or run away. Aikido is kind of like the tiny screwdriver set. It's not fake. It just has a very small range of circumstances to which it is appropriate. So you should do it and also recognize its limitations. I think it's a great thing to do. And if I had the opportunity, I would still be doing it, but the closest place is hours away. Mm-hmm. That being said, I wrist lock the shit out of everyone, which is not like, standard kind of jiu-jitsu techniques, even though it's part of jiu-jitsu. But because I've been wrist locking in Aikido for 15 years, I can bring that technique to jiu-jitsu. So my Aikido works in that context because I already know jiu-jitsu, right? But if you're thinking about Aikido as a standalone self-defense platform, you're going to get fucked up, period. Because the way it's trained, there's nothing illegitimate about the techniques. It's the training methodology that does not prepare you for a fight. And that should be acknowledged. And I think a lot of Aikido instructors do acknowledge that. But this idea of like, hey man, all I know is Aikido and I'm good, I'll just sidestep. Like, nah, dude, that's not going to work. You're going to get killed. And you need to have an honest conversation. Like, why do you do this? Or why do I know all these things and I would still go do Aikido again? You know why? Because I like it. I think it's a good thing to do. And I like the people that do Aikido, generally. And it's fun. And the ukemi is probably the most useful thing you're going to get out of that. I mean, how many times are you going to fall in your life accidentally compared to how many times are you going to get in a street match? Which one is more statistically relevant, right? So look at Aikido for what it is. There's no need to disparage it as like fake martial arts or something. I think that's a bad argument. But recognize the fact that the techniques of Aikido are only appropriate at a certain distance and in a small range of circumstances. It would be easier sometimes just to cold cock somebody in the face. And they're like, shit, I just got fucked up. I'm going to stop. That's a legitimate solution. You didn't kill him, right? And Aikido views any other art other than Aikido as like just violence, right? And that's not the case. Violence can be applied in incremental amounts. Hitting someone and running away is totally legitimate. I mean, can you imagine doing a Rimi Nagi on someone on the concrete? Their skull is going to explode when they hit the ground. How is that a peaceful resolution of the conflict? So well, I don't buy that, like, these techniques are somehow magical because they offer a peaceful resolution to this situation.
Yeah.
That is not accurate.
My experience with Aikido is that it gets this reputation as the art of peace or some kind of peaceful martial art that's about harmonizing, and that this my understanding is that comes from Aikido is a modern martial art that was invented in the 20th century by the way, a religious fundamentalist and fascist. Like, and all the earlier practitioners were rich fascists, like religious maniacs. That's just a side note, but that basically, when the United States was occupying Japan after World War II, they banned martial arts, just like they banned their army and everything. And that Aikido, in order to pass the censors, had to present itself as a peaceful, like harmonizing martial art. And also, like, the real reason that it was able to pass the censors is because, again, it was run by extremely rich and powerful people who had friends in the government and that were fascists. But Aikido has lost a lot of popularity. I mean, I don't know if it ever had a lot of popularity, but it certainly doesn't hold up in UFC. And so the driving, like, it doesn't work in that context, so it can't compete with jiu-jitsu. But also the other problem is, and I mean, this is a problem with all martial arts and with all art in general, the further you get from the source where it was practiced with a certain rigor and a fervor, it gets diluted as it kind of seeps out, and especially when it gets to America. And Aikido at this point is extremely diluted, and it's still pretty close. Like, my teacher's teacher studied with the founder of Aikido, so that's 3 generations removed from the source. It's not a lot, like, especially compared with a lot of, like, I mean, like, with Kung Fu or some of these more like kind of ancient arts. But that being said, in general, 90% of the dojos in America are total shit. It's a diluted art form, and it kind of relies on these like completely ludicrous ideas about peaceful harmonizing, where it's just like, and also they've taken the striking out of an art form in which now it's incoherent without striking. Aikido does not work without striking, and for the most part it's just practiced without this striking form, and the only way
Neither
that
does
it
a
can be
labor
practiced there
movement.
is make believe. It requires the person taking ukemi to just go along with go along with it for no reason. I mean, this is a tangent about Aikido in particular, but I think we should. Max, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I think that you went on a long tangent and that you should apologize to our audience.
We've now been having this podcast for over an hour, which I'm like, this might have to end up being a 2-part episode, which is totally fine because we haven't even gotten into the most relevant thing for everyone. I mean, I think this was an extremely interesting conversation for me as a practitioner of martial arts, and anyone else who's sort of interested in that world. If you don't care about martial arts, you are not listening anymore. You have turned this off because I think that the solution is to end part 1 of this episode and then transition into part 2, which will be available for people next week, and that it will be a conversation about the pandemic and the government's response and how that could have been done better. I still am interested in guerrilla warfare in the United States and how to have, like, if there is any version of like, even as a thought experiment of a revolution happening in America, a violent overthrow of the government, what that would look like. Is that something that you can talk about, Roger or Max, or should I drop that thread? Violent revolution.
Yes.
It's not really my lane, Sam. I'll be honest with you. I mean, I do certain things well. That's not really one of them.
Okay, well, so then can I go back to something that you said?
And you're a goddamn
which is that
embarrassment, and he
the
wouldn't share his plans with you.
What'd you say, Max?
Okay, are you sure? I said you are a goddamn embarrassment, and Roger wouldn't share his well-laid plans with you.